Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt. Mustafa Suleyman. This is part two of the interview I did with Mustafa Suleyman on Wednesday. I talked to President Trump on Tuesday. I talked to Mustafa. Actually, I talked to Mustafa on Tuesday night. I played a portion of it for you yesterday, and I will play more of it next week. This is part two of his book on the coming wave. He's one of the co-founders of DeepMind and Inflection AI. John Ellis of Ellis News Item says that, Mustafa Suleyman is the guy, one of a handful of people who actually understand what AI means for the world, for your children, for your grandchildren. And I want you to hear part two now of Mustafa Suleyman talking about the coming wave. And very well done. And the alarm is sounding clear here. And I want people to understand that you are no fan of totalitarian control techniques. And you write very candidly about the surveillance state that is the Chinese Communist Party and the fact that they are perfecting via the use of ACI and a great deal of camera and surveillance what is going to become the omnipresent state. And I don't know how they can ever undo that. Do you, Mustafa? Do you have any sense that you can go backwards after you've crossed that line?
You're totally right. I'm very scared about it. I think it is genuinely something that we should be worried about. Like dystopian authoritarian surveillance is going to be one of the major threats that we face in this next wave of technology because it just makes it easier to hoover up lots of data, to track everybody's movements. I mean, we're now moving from, tracking people's faces to now tracking people's gait, the style with which you walk. That is actually a unique signature that can be recorded, and you can actually tell the difference from between in a crowd between different people just based on the view from behind in terms of the way they walk, right? So look, there's huge benefit to these kinds of technologies. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Obviously we all care deeply about security and we want to make sure that we have law and order in our countries, but at the same time, it does create more and more concentrated power. And this is the confusing thing about the coming wave. It actually does two contradictory things at the same time. On the one hand, it actually empowers authoritarian or centralized regimes, let's call it, everywhere you look, from companies to governments, whether they're democratic or they're dictatorships. On the other hand, it also spreads power because, these models, these new types of AI are also available in what's called open source software, right? You can actually download the code from the internet and run it yourself on your own hosted instance of the software. And on the face of it, that's a great story because it means everybody is going to get access to some of the best new techniques to make predictions, to do ranking algorithms, to help us build great software in the world, right? That's great. The downside is that can also be used for manipulation and harm and spreading dissent and all sorts of things, right? So that's really the threat on the open source front, is the potential for bad actors to take advantage of it.
Okay, by way of background for you, about 2 weeks ago, Tristan Harris of the center that tries to suggest regulatory means came on the show and gave his dark dystopian vision of what happens. And 4 or 5 years ago, I went out to Palo Alto with a bunch of conservative writers, and we sat around Mark Zuckerberg's dining room, and he talked to us. And I asked him a question I want to ask you, see what your answer compares with his. Is it possible, with enough data on the people who have shot up schools before, and they generally fit a pattern that we recognize, alienated youth, mostly male, under the age of 22, with mental problems out of certain family structures. I asked him if we could predict Minority Report, a la Minority Report, who would be a school shooter. And he said flatly, no. What do you say, Mustafa Suleyman?
I think it's very unlikely. I would say the probability that you could do that has increased over the last 5 years for two reasons. Firstly, the prediction algorithms have got much, much better than they were 5 years ago. And secondly, we're now collecting much more data that describes behaviors that we can then use to make predictions. But I would say that is not a desirable end state, right? To my mind, you know, you're basically describing collecting vast amounts of private information about all sorts of people, young and old, at school and in families and at work. And, in order to make that prediction, I think that would be really dangerous infringement of our civil liberties. And I think the potential harm that would arise to justify that data collection would need to be really extreme. I really don't mean to trivialize the consequences of a school shooting. It's truly awful. But I think it would need to be a risk of millions of people dying as a result to justify that. For example, you could imagine on the synthetic biology side of things, which is the other half of this new wave of technologies which is coming, is that people with fewer and fewer skills and training in biology are soon going to be able to engineer new types of pandemics, pathogens that have pandemic grade qualities, like they can spread really fast. They're even more lethal than previously. They can attach to different hosts. So it's getting cheaper and easier to use the tools of modern computational biology, and some bad actors, some potential school shooters, for example, now like might in the future be able to use those kind of tricks. That would be truly horrific and potentially causes mass harm, and I think would justify more interventionist surveillance to try and prevent it.
Yeah. If you find authoritarians who are mad as hatters, they're going to take the coming wave and demand of their scientists the ability to synthesize bioweapons using whatever open AI software codes are out there. And years ago, before this got started, my toxicologist brother told me, forget nukes, forget chemical weapons, biological weapons are the ones that
Right.
will eventually lead to world disaster. Let me bounce off you before I go back to the specifics of the coming wave. Do you remember Charles Krauthammer, the great American commentator, columnist, and pundit?
Yeah.
Charles wrote an essay before he died on why we hadn't been contacted by intelligent life. And it was his theory, and he was an agnostic, that it's because all higher forms of civilization destroy themselves. I've always thought that rather haunting. What do you think of that proposition?
I think it's too pessimistic. I mean, look, it's an easy speculation to make. I mean, we're certainly as a species both becoming more civilized in the sense that we don't club people over the head with batons anymore, but we're certainly inventing new lethal ways to be able to impact hundreds of millions of people in one go. And the challenge is that the tools that we're using to implement that both deliver good and potential harm in equal measure, right? So, the power to broadcast information is now available to millions and millions of people. I think that can only be a good thing, right? In the past, you had to have a printing press, you had to be a licensed journalist, you had to have money for an education. Today, you can just broadcast on social media and pick your platform of choice, and I think that's an incredible transformation and delivered huge amounts of benefit. But if that same trajectory applies to this new wave of synthetic biology, and you can just engineer new compounds really easily just with a natural language instruction with one of these large language models, that would be pretty bad. But I do think that it's worth being optimistic about this. Like, we've had dangerous and confusing and scary new technologies many times before. I mean, people who first saw, escalators or new aircrafts, new flight. I mean, they were petrified of flight, right? And we actually now have aircraft that are safer than most forms of transport. It's kind of incredible that we could get into a plane at 40,000 feet and fly comfortably and confidently every time. So we just have to apply the same level of scrutiny and caution and care that we have done for previous waves.
Well, I want to spend at least half of our time talking about that we have to apply part, because that's the regulatory scheme, which is the most difficult nut. A lot of what is valuable about the coming wave is that you spend the first half of the book teaching people who might not otherwise know, the common reader who's generally interested in things, the history of science and the history of technological advance and sort of the march, this inexorable progress. And then you start talking about a couple of fields in which we have to be specifically very careful. And you talk about the Turing test and the modern Turing test. And I like to use this. I'd love you to explain both of them to the audience so that I don't screw it up. Because to me, it presented exactly what you're concerned about. Because if we do get to something that passes the modern Turing test, we're all kind of screwed, I think, Mustafa.
So, for your listeners, benefit, a lot of people won't know what the Turing test is. I think the Turing test was proposed by a British computer scientist, actually, in the 50s, Alan Turing, who basically said, if you want to evaluate whether or not a machine is intelligent, you should look at what it says. And if it can imitate human speech well enough to hold a conversation with another human, such that they can't tell whether there's a human speaking or a machine speaking, then you could say that it's passed the Turing test and it's probably intelligent. That was his thesis. And for the last 60 or 70 years, that's been a North Star for machine learning and AI researchers, and a great inspiration to many of us. But now, for anybody who's played with any of these large language models, these chatbots, whether it's ChatGPT or my own company, Inflection AI, we have an AI called Pi, which you can find at pi.ai, stands for personal intelligence. It's a very conversational, fluid, human-like, chatty experience. It's super knowledgeable. It's very kind. It's really respectful. It's just like chatting to somebody at a bar or asking a local for directions, in a new village that you're visiting. And you could probably say that it's close to passing the Turing test. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's intelligent. It's just good at imitating good conversation, and it's very, very knowledgeable. And so I think it's probably time for us to rethink the Turing test. And in my book, I propose a modern Turing test, one that focuses not on just on what AIs can say, but more importantly on what they can do and what their capabilities are. And that goes back to the ACI concept, artificial capable intelligence.
Now, what I found flabbergasting is that your test, one example would be to say to any ACI function, here's $100,000, produce me a company that makes $1 million, get me a 10x return on my investment, and do all of the sequenced tasks that go into that. Anyone who started a company, and you've started a few, know that that's almost impossible to detail the business plan. And then the business plan gets thrown out on day one and you start a second business plan. Do you think we're close to that, Mustafa? Where someone can say... We'll wait for the answer. I'll play that next hour in part 3 of my interview with Mustafa Suleyman. Don't go anywhere, America. It's the Friday edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Stay right where you are.